Tuari Potiki, ladies and gentlemen.
I too would like to thank Jim for the introduction, Ross for the invitation, Jared, my boss, for allowing me to do this, and trusting that I'll do the right thing. And just to reiterate that I'm not speaking on behalf of ALEC, who I work for. When Ross approached me, he asked me if I wanted to speak, and I asked him what about. He said, well, you're an ex-drug user, you've been through treatment, and then he said, and you're married, so you can talk a bit about that, and you can open and close the forum and bless our food. So that was my scope. Where I've ended up is picking a few things that I want to talk about, and if it feels a little bit random, it's probably pretty accurate because that's how my head works. Also want to apologise, I've had the flu for a week, which I thought I'd got rid of it, but it came back with a vengeance on Sunday, so I'm a little bit not quite all here, but it probably helps. Just before I start though, just very briefly, can people out there who have either personally experienced an alcohol and drug problem or have someone close to them who has, just put your hands up. There's quite a few, well over half. Cool, thanks. I'll just come back to that a bit later on. So what I wanted to talk about were three things: purpose of treatment, Whanau as deliverers of service, and reconfiguring service delivery, which I thought was a rather flash thing to be talking about. First thing I wanted to talk about really was the purpose of treatment, because I think we talk about it as if it's the same thing and means the same to everybody, and that everyone has a similar expectation of what it is, what it does, and what the outcome will be. And I think there's a lot of different expectations and influences as to what treatment is offered and what treatment is received. Obviously, there are the services that we all go to, who are influenced by government, obviously, the funder, by their management and how that all operates and the sorts of protocols they put in place around who does what and how often. The contracts that they have to deliver services, obviously. Regulation, that Ian touched on a bit of that and others have as well. The regulation and codes really that oversee the practice that we do, including things like, we know them all, health and disability, privacy. There's a whole lot of regulations and codes that we all have to practice by. So from a service perspective, there are expectations about what will be done and things that influence how things will be done. Secondly, obviously, there are the clinicians, the people who do the work, the people who sit down and talk to you, or whoever it may be. Influenced by things, it's their job. I think it's worth acknowledging that it's for a lot of people, obviously in this field, it's their income, it's their career, it's what they do for a living. That influences what they do and how they do it. Some, as Ian has mentioned, are in it for a long time, others are in it for a shorter period and for different reasons. There's obviously the training that you've had, the profession that you're a part of that influences what you do. There are your personal beliefs and your behaviour, so that does impinge on what we talked about before, around morals, around what you personally believe, around life, the universe, the world and everything, about drug use, about drug users. Ideology, what drives you, the culture you come from, and of course, clinical best practice. Remembering Doug's in the room. Then of course you have the person, I've called them a client rather than a consumer, the person who you're trying to help. Why are they there? What's the thing that got them in the door? What are the problems they're experiencing? Do they want to be drug free, or do they want to experience less harm? Are they moving from something or to something? From problems, etc., pain, or are they wanting to head to a better place? Because there is a bit of a difference. And Whanau, the family, which hasn't been talked about much today. What are the expectations and things from families in Whanau that influence treatment and the purpose of treatment? Roles in the family, the experiences of the family, the future plans that the Whanau, the family may have, the leadership within the family, and whakapapa, which is genealogy. And from a Māori perspective, that can be a very, very strong influence over why you may seek help, what your whānau may expect happens when you get help, and why you should get help. So which of these determines the ideal treatment outcome? How are these different expectations and influences prioritised and managed? How much of it is overt? And who has the final say and why? I think this, to me, highlights why it's so hard to have, and we've tried it for a long time, hard to have a voice for the sector. There's a whole lot of different voices in our sector. The trick is to gather them all up into one kind of choir that can sing in harmony. I've thrown this slide up because it was something that I read recently, out of a paper got by this guy McKigney. And I know that it's only one study, it's not a meta-analysis, so it won't hold up to rigour, but the interesting thing was, there were two different things he talked about. The first one was a study, 1,007 drug users interviewed were contacting treatment services in an attempt to become drug-free. That was their language. The second study he talked about was a drug user satisfaction survey, 2006, that involved over 8,500 drug users. And of those, 77% of heroin users, 72% of crack cocaine users, and almost 60% of amphetamine users stated that their goal from treatment was to stop using the drug. That was their goal when they turned up. And I think it's interesting that even within that group, there are differences, almost 20%, which tells me that it's not just a stock standard kind of response, that actually there were differences in between those different drug using groups. So becoming drug-free, and I don't use the word abstinent because personally I don't like it. To me it's got connotations. I haven't used drugs for over 20 years, and that's how I talk about it. I don't say I'm abstinent. I haven't eaten Brussels sprouts for over 20 years either, but I don't say I'm abstinent from Brussels sprouts. And to me there are connotations that go with that word that I think impact on how it's heard, in my opinion. To me, it's a bit similar to people talking about living in sin rather than being in a de facto relationship or being with a partner. I think there's just a little connotation that has some religiosity to it. That is a bit of a barrier. Anyway, so I talk about being drug-free. So becoming drug-free was the primary goal underpinning the decision to contact these drug treatment services. They did a follow-up in Scotland. After 33 months, only 8% were drug-free, excluding alcohol and tobacco. And obviously, this was geared up around harm reduction and the role of harm reduction in alcohol and drug treatment. So most of the people, obviously, who were heroin users were offered opioid substitution therapy, and rightly so. My issue, though, is I guess the last one I mentioned is the point I guess I'm trying to make, is around harm reduction and how it connects with the continuum of well-being and wellness that we often talk about in situations like this, because I think we talk about it, but we don't actually practice it. There's no doubt that things like that harm reduction works, without a doubt. Opioid substitution therapy, needle exchange, has saved and continues to save lives and families, without a doubt. But I often get a bit concerned that it's become an end in itself rather than a means to an end, and that we rather than harm reduction being an ongoing fluid staged process with re-evaluated goals, it ends up being they're on this and now they're okay, move on. And my experience of methadone was that it was punitive, it was fairly short lasting. This is prior to the methadone revolution. And then you had to go and do a proper residential treatment. And initially the change that occurred in New Zealand anyway was driven by the fear of HIV spreading out into the community. And it happened very, very quickly. When I was on methadone, they used to do things like blind countdowns. So you had to go along and pick up every day, supervised, and they'd count you off methadone without telling you. just little tricks of the trade. And then you'd go in and you'd find out you'd been drinking syrup for the last couple of weeks, and they'd say, aha. Got you can go away and do this residential program now. But it was very punitive, and you couldn't get 40 mils was like a maximum dose. Very hard to get on, very easy to get off, and it was limited to about 6 months, and then you had to go and do a residential treatment. Almost overnight that changed. driven by, initially, the fear of HIV, and more latterly, probably HCV. But the fear was around, the primary driver, I think, was around wanting to limit its spread into the community, which was successful. Particularly in New Zealand, we were very, very early adapters and adopters of harm reduction strategies. My concern is, though, that that's a bit different than it being driven by what's necessarily best or ideal for the drug user. And the point I guess I'm trying to make through all of this is I just hope that we're not setting the bar too low when it comes to the treatment we're offering and who we're offering it to. I worry that we're inadvertently perpetuating a stereotype around IV drug users in particular being criminal, dirty, as in infected with something, low functioning, and that parking them up on opioid substitution treatment is okay because of that. I'm not saying that in any way we should back away from or decrease services we're providing to this population, absolutely not. I just think we have to get really, really clear about what an ideal outcome looks like. The other concern I have with this, and it's something that relates, it's sort of cultural really, is around the wairua. And from a Māori perspective, there's a strong belief that the main harm that alcohol and drugs cause to people is to their spirit, to their wairua, and that all drugs affect the wairua, be they prescribed or not. And that given that we believe that the wairua or the spirit is quite an essential part of wellness and well-being and helping you to get well, that it can't work properly if you continue to be affected by alcohol and drugs. So my first point really is just about where we set the bar, what our expectations are as a sector and as a field. Once again, I'm not promoting or encouraging at all that we back away from any of the harm reduction initiatives that we're currently doing, and they're all, like I said, they are saving lives on a daily basis. I just want us not to, to keep raising our eyes to the horizon and believing that everyone we treat has the potential. And also to bear in mind that the large number of people who come to our services initially are wanting to be drug-free, and how we manage to talk them out of that and why. The other thing, just jumping around a bit, whanau or family. When I talk about family, I'm talking about your blood relations, but also your wider support network. When I did some training on how to be an alcohol and drug counsellor, we were told, let's just say a third. A third of people get well with help, going to see a clinician or something. A third of people just sort of spontaneously get well, and a third, I think, continue pretty well using as they were. Now, this is probably a bit more provocative, this next section, but that's probably okay. I remember when I first started in this week, someone told me, your job is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. So if I do a bit of that today, I'll be happy. Most of the resource we're talking about, everything we've been talking about today, actually goes to that first third. We're talking about our clinical workforce, the people who are out there doing it on a day-to-day basis. Seems to me that the second third, those people who manage to give up their alcohol and drug use and get out of their alcohol and drug problems without the help of a clinical intervention, most would have some sort of help, often from family and friends. And I wonder if there's a way in our thinking, or as we think further down the track, of how we can support family and friends to look after and care for their own. We keep talking about, and I'll talk a little bit later about this, about there's no more money, pressure on services is getting greater. We can't sort of grow our workforce at the same pace as the demand seems to be rising, especially when you hear, Paula Bennett and others talking about what's happening with benefits, and they're going to send benefit people to get alcohol and drug counselling, and straight away we all think, well, who's going to do that? So is that something that we can think about? And I'm not talking about involving significant others or family inclusive practice, because both of those to me are still involve a clinician at the centre of it, telling other people what to do. What I'm talking about is actually how we empower and support families to genuinely look after their own. I read somewhere recently there's about it was 1998, so I think it's a bit more than this now, but 111 million a year spent on alcohol and drug treatment. I think it might be closer to 120 million a year. About 25,000 people being treated, about 30,000 people. Works out to, I worked it out anyway using my calculator, to about 4,500 each per episode, per person, if you were able to do it like that. And of course I know you're not, but I just wondered what it would look like if whānau could shop around for treatment. Kind of like rich people do now. If that money was allocated to a person to go and shop around and have a look and see what's available. We have some examples here. I think midwifery. Well, it's a long time ago now, but when our last baby was born, that's what happened. Tracy had some money available to her, and she was able to go and shop around for a midwife, and she did, and we found someone who was really great. Similarly, I noticed just a few days ago, up in Tauranga, there was a new initiative launched by Minister Ryla called Local Area Coordination, where people with intellectual disabilities were given access to their resource, and then they could go and decide what it was going to be spent on, rather than being told you are eligible for one of these and three of these and four of those. So I think the model's already there. But I do wonder what change would occur were we to put the power in the shape of the money into the hands of the people who have the problems or their families. What sort of changes might we see in the way services are delivered, who, by, where, how often, what times? Would the GP, would primary care be so reluctant to get involved? Were there dollars hanging from people's earlobes? Don't know, it just makes you wonder. And lastly, I just can't talk about this without mentioning whānau order, which is, as you know, a significant government policy. And actually, that's what whānau order is really about. Oh, hang on, I've just realised I haven't put direct resourcing to families in whānau order. Its intention was to put the decision-making back into the hands of the people who need the services and their whānau. That was the initial driver, and I think still is, for whānau order. So all of that, all of the work and all of the programs you've heard was about getting the resource closer to the people and giving people more decision-making over the services they receive. So that's the other thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about was just around some different ideas about how we could do things. Lastly, service reconfiguration, I got rid of that. New ways of doing things. This was NCAT, the National Committee for Alcohol Treatment, Addiction Treatment. 2008, the capacity of addiction services needs to double to enable the most severely affected by addiction to gain timely access to treatment. This was 2008. And doubling, at the time, doubling it would get us able to treat 1% of the population who need help. I think also in that document it says that given that we've got a population of about 4 million now, who's good at maths? What's 3% of 4 million? 100,000? It's a lot more than that anyway. No. So we've got like 30,000 odd people getting treatment at the moment. Potentially the need is upwards of 100,000. To me, that's an issue that we can't shy away from. That's a statistic that we can't pretend doesn't exist, because it means even if we were able to double what we have available to us today, if that miracle happened that Doug talked about, the hand came out of the sky and it was doubled, we'd still be only reaching perhaps half at most of people who actually needed those services in that year. We already know about our capacity. There are wait lists for treatment all over the place. Assessment, methadone, to get into residential programs. I've been in situations up here in Wellington where I've been in meetings where people have been discussing new initiatives that will increase access to treatment. However, they weren't supported because services are overloaded already and it would just increase the bottleneck. That's the reality. Same when we talk about primary care. It's one of the issues that some people have around screening and brief intervention in primary care, is that it's just going to drive more demand to already overstretched services, specialist services. We talk about the workforce, more workers. What sort of workers, where and doing what? And what's workforce expansion being driven by? Is it more of the same, to provide more of the same? When I went through treatment, that was a definition that was given to me of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I kind of think we have to do things differently because we don't have a choice. Or we shouldn't have a choice. What are the options? We've talked about a lot of them today. Models, different ways of doing things, different ways of funding. Primary care has to be in our future planning, whether we like it or not. Screening and brief intervention has to be brought into the fold as a part of what we do. And who we are aligned with, rather than just mental health, has to be a part of our thinking as well. DHB's Ministry of Health, is it time to pull all of those alcohol and drug services back out of those DHBs and just have it centrally coordinated from somewhere who knows what's going on from one end of the country to the other? Avenues of funding. Are there other ways to get some more resource into the sector? Insurance, people talked about that before. Are there opportunities there to get some more others to contribute to the problems that are being experienced, alcohol and drug problems? We need to think outside the square and to talk to people who can think outside the square. But the first thing we have to do, and what we can do right now, is increase our expectation of what will be available to who and when. And we can do that if we're willing. We can do that right now if we want to. Just very briefly, and I know I'm running out of time, I just wanted to talk a little wee bit about my personal experience. I was in and around treatment for about 4 or 5 years, different types of treatment, counselling, residential, 4 different residential programs, methadone for a while. Stopped using eventually 5 months after I'd been to the last treatment centre. So I stopped using there and then. I had to go out and try a few things. When I think of the benefits of the residential program that I went to, it was about getting away from the scene. For me, that was quite important, to get away from those places, people and things. Being drug-free was hugely important because I didn't know what that was like until I'd been drug-free for a while. I didn't have anything to compare with anything else because all I knew was to be out of it all the time. So how can you even know what it's like not to be if you haven't experienced it? And the things that occurred in that program that really, really helped me later were anger management, assertiveness, self-awareness, relapse prevention, dealing with your feelings, and learning that I wasn't different or mad or bad. I just had this issue with drugs. And in hindsight, getting off the drugs was the easy part. I never would have believed that, though, prior to going in. Then I had to learn how to live. And Doug mentioned a bit of that before. Life on life's terms is how we used to term it. And it wasn't easy. And it wasn't easy. And when I say it wasn't, I mean it really, really wasn't easy. And I had to deal with a whole lot of things. 3 years into giving up drugs, my son and wife died in a fire. So it wasn't sort of an easy road, just sort of step. It was sort of up and down. But there were a whole lot of people around me who were able to support me through that. And I think that's one of the really important things that we need to keep thinking about, is how we encourage people that we work with to connect and stay connected to people who can help them. Because a clinician isn't always going to be around. Then I trained as an alcohol and drug counsellor, which was quite difficult because back in the day, when I trained, as today actually, I think 12-step wasn't popular. In fact, it was actively criticised. And when I was doing my training, I was actively encouraged by the tutor to start drinking again, which I thought was a bit strange. But her rationale, supported by the group, was for me to have recovered from the drinking thing, I needed to be able to go and have a drink. And she said the analogy she used was, if you break your leg, you don't walk around on crutches for the rest of your life and say you've recovered from your broken leg. Recovery is when you can use your leg normally. So I learnt a few things in that one afternoon. One was that some book-learnt people are dangerous. combined with that they didn't really understand me or know what I was about. And the second thing that I learned was that when I put it back to them that I'd been mainly a drug user, so did the same thing apply to drugs? So were they suggesting I could go out and use IV socially, which seemed like quite a good idea at the time? No, hell no. They were hugely against that. That no. Alcohol, yes, drugs, no. So the other thing I learnt was somewhere in amongst all that, there was a kind of a moral driver coming through, covertly, not overtly, which was alcohol okay because it's legal, drugs not okay, illegal, criminal. And that even though they couldn't see what they were doing, they were actually, in my eyes anyway, encouraging or discouraging something based more on a moral/legal view, perspective than what may or may not have been best for me or suited to me. And I think that's really important, because up to 30% of people who refer to alcohol and drug services in New Zealand come from the justice sector. And I do worry that people have these underlying kind of perceptions or misperceptions around dealing with criminals. The other thing I was called was a positive, I was going to say abomination, but it wasn't abomination, aberration, because the treatment that I had statistically it shouldn't have worked, because I was a long-term IV drug user. And we have very low, apparently, success rates of becoming abstinent and staying abstinent. So I was a positive aberration, and I've hung on to that, which means that, I was an aberration in that what happened to me shouldn't have happened, but it had a positive outcome. I think there's a whole lot of positive aberrations walking around the place, and I know quite a few of them, and we hang out together quite often. And so that's bit of my experience. But I just want to finish now, and right at the start of this, I asked you to put your hands up, and well over half the people in the room did put their hands up. And the point I guess I wanted to make in doing that was that when we talk about alcohol and drug services, we're actually talking about clients, about people who come into the room, as Ian so eloquently talked about before, who need our help, who need our assistance for something. They are us. They're people like you, they're your families and your friends, and they're people like me, literally. Your sons, your daughters, your husbands, your wives, your brothers, your sisters, your family and your friends. And as a starting place, we need to be thinking about what sort of help would I want them to have if they needed it. And secondly, how would you want to be included in that process if that was to occur? So that's enough from me. We've gone on a bit, but just wanted to bring a slightly different perspective on the discussions that we were having today. And once again, thanks for the invitation. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Tuari.